continuing on in our series on Jesus' 7 signs in the book of John. Who has been reading a little bit of John? Anybody started? Okay. You're like, every Sunday we read a chapter, so I'm doing great. That's awesome. That's fine. Bless you. The word still speaks. So if you haven't been with us though, this is maybe you just missed a couple weeks. What John does in his gospel is through the first 11 chapters, he tells us 7 specific miracle stories. Now, you'll find that the rest of John, after chapter 11, Jesus is really just speaking and walking. He's not doing any miracles. It's really focused on his time with the disciples at the Last Supper, and he's speaking to them in those last few weeks before the final Passover, before his death. But in the first 11 chapters, that's where all the action is in John. And what John does is he calls the miracles signs. He's saying they're not just miracles, they're signs that point to tell us about who Jesus is. There's something more going on. It's not just that a blind man sees. There's something we're learning about Jesus and about us. And they're pointing us, the point of the miracles is to point us so that we trust in Jesus. Because he knows if we can trust in him, we'll have life. And that's what he said. I come that you might have life and life abundant. So John has been building a case for our faith to trust in Jesus as the Messiah and the Son of God. And each story is targeted to reveal his glory, that he's the one we've been waiting for. So, who remembers, if you weren't here last week, when we read through our 3rd sign in the book of John chapter 5, we heard about a paralyzed man lying at the pool longing to get in. Does anybody remember that story? The water stirred, and the guy's waiting and longing to get in the water, because if you got in the water, you'd be healed. And what we learned last week, by way of just reminder, is we learned that we too, all of us, are longing and waiting for things. Just right now, think about it. You're waiting and longing for something, aren't you? Aren't we all? We learned that we are waiting in our place of need. And one of the things that we pointed out is that if you tried to group all of our longings together, like you're longing for something, I'm longing for something, you'd probably find at the bottom that we're all longing for at least 7 things, or potentially one of 7 things more than others. And these are the 7 things. We're all longing for justice. Do you see that in the world? People longing for justice? Anybody? Longing for freedom. I think we're longing for freedom. I think didn't we have a convoy about freedom? Right? We're longing for it. We're longing for beauty. We're longing for relationship or spirituality, to connect with something greater than ourselves. We're all longing for truth. We're longing for power. We're longing for love. Now, what we noted about those longings, is all of those longings, is that, does anybody note that they're not really satisfied in this world? Will we find justice in the world that we live in? Has anybody found it? No. Anybody found freedom? It's elusive. Anybody found truth or power that doesn't get corrupted or that isn't fake? And what we noted is that we never find them. And if that's true, that we're longing creatures, and that all of us are ultimately longing for something that isn't going to manifest in this lifetime, even if it's healing. So how many of us long to be healed, to be made whole? We long for the freedom of our bodies to not be, depressed and ruined by sickness or disease. I'm longing for that. Right? We have friends that are not well. And the ultimate thing is that healing doesn't ultimately come. There's death at the end, isn't there? And so what we found is that there's 2 possibilities that remain then. Either we will end up being crushed by the heartbreaking disappointment that our desires will not be realized. You see that? You might get to the end of your life and the very thing that you longed for doesn't come true. Or you realize that 20 years out and you live upset or frustrated or depressed or disappointed because the thing that you're longing for won't come. So we'll either end up being crushed, or we can choose to live as though all of our unmet desires are simply pointing us to something that which we're longing for that is not of this world. Does anybody recognize that? That the things you're longing for, if you can't find them in this world, then it means that you must be longing for a world that is yet to come. Either the world is completely cruel, or there's something still to come. Or either the world is completely twisted and evil, and we should all give up. I'm not encouraging you to do that. But this is the philosophy. We all should give up now, or we're actually longing for something that is yet to come, that isn't found here on this earth. Who remembers, I was singing it this week. I was going through kind of a memory trip. I was listening to old Switchfoot songs, and they have that song, right? We were meant to live for so much more. Everything inside, they say, screams for second life. Now, who's heard of C.S. Lewis? This is really his argument. But he talked about this. He said, if you know the desire within yourself for which there is no satisfaction, it must mean that there's a place for that to come, a world that you have not yet experienced where that longing will be satisfied. And he wrote this, and I think it's really profound. He said there's a certain shyness that he felt about admitting that at first, that he was longing for a world that hadn't yet come. That's a pretty big thing to say as a person. That all the things I'm hoping for in this world actually aren't here. And he said, I'm shy about it. He said, because all of our modern philosophy for the last 200 years have been obsessed with making earth into heaven. Right? Everything, we're convinced we can make it happen here. We can get the things we want in this life. But he said, ultimately, we all know that isn't going to happen. We're not going to have our desires met. And he wrote this, he said, I'm trying to rip open that inconsolable secret that lies within each one of you. That the things unseen are simply the things not yet seen. The things that we can't see or touch, grab hold of, are actually just things yet to come. He wants to get inside and open that up. And not let that be just something small that we sort of pacify and push down, but to let the longing grow. Now, I want us to turn that over and get that comfortable in our hearts for just a moment. How aware have you been that you are actually longing, in all of your longings, for a world that doesn't yet exist? Would you be willing to admit that today? I was thinking about that this week. All of the things I want aren't going to be found in this life likely. There's a world still to come. And I want you to admit that takes courage to say that, doesn't it? To stand up and say, I'm not living for this world. I'm living for a world that I can't even see yet. To admit that what I want isn't really found here. And it takes courage because most of us have been living with the hope of satisfying our desires in this life, haven't we? I've been living like that. I imagine that the things I want will be satisfied here. But here's the thing. All that does is it makes you a slave. And I know that's strong language. But it makes you a slave. Because what else tell me this, what else do you call someone who endlessly works for a reward that they never get? That's what a slave is. All work, no pay or play. You're always under the rule. You're always striving for something that won't come. You won't get it. And we have to admit that we've actually been living as slaves to our desires because we want to get them met in this life. And here's what you notice about, we watched Charlie and the Chocolate Factory last night with the kids. And there's that one little girl. Do you remember her name? I think it was Veruca Salt. And she says, Daddy, I want a squirrel too. Daddy, I want a pony. And the dad completely caves in and gives her everything she wants. And that's what happens when you get spoiled thinking that you're going to get your desires met, is you become demanding, inconsolable, upset, crushed in the heart because you don't get what you want. Now, here's this. It's surprising for us to discover that that's true, that we are living as slaves. Don't worry, we're going to get to John in just a moment. It's even more surprising that we chose that life. We chose our earthly masters. We chose to say, I am going to live for that freedom, and if I don't, I'm going to fight for it my whole life. But if I don't get it, we realize we're just slaves to it. We believe the world's false promises just the same way that Eve believed the serpent. It's not uncommon for people to live willingly as slaves. Do you remember Israel when they left Egypt? They'd just been delivered by God, and things get a little bit difficult. And what do they say? I wish we could go back. It'd be safe there. We'd have a master to tell us everything's going to be okay. That's what we're used to. And I want us to say this morning, I want you to be courageous this morning to admit that I don't want to live for those desires anymore. I don't want to live as a slave to my earthly desires and not realize that that's actually a longing for heaven. And that's why it takes courage that we won't be enslaved to some singular cause or God or anything that finds treasure in this life. And I just said anything. Anything. It's revolution. It's the language of revolution, isn't it? And not an earthly revolution, but it's a language of revolution nonetheless. I will not be enslaved to the things of the world. And of course, it's one thing to admit that in the safety of a church service. Anybody want to just say that? I'm rebelling. And it's another thing to live that truth, to declare it every day. But that's what it takes. Because that kind of life goes against the grain of everyone and everything whose hope still rests in this world. The whole world that we live in, that we're a part of, is hoping and longing for heaven to be on earth. But they don't want heaven. They just want earth to become heaven. Who still work and value the things that fade away. Who still chase after wealth and comfort and happiness with reckless abandon. We're just chasing after it. And yet the facts are evident. Our experience tells us the truth. Everyone longs. Everyone hungers for something. But in the eating of it, in the tasting and the experience, we find we're not satisfied. Tell me this. Sports are a great example of this. You watch the guys who have worked so hard, and this will never be the Maple Leafs, I'm sure, but they work so hard to hoist the cup, to raise the trophy. And do you know what? 5 minutes, one day, not long after they raise the cup, what do they find? They've reached the pinnacle. They've got it all. And what do they find? They're longing for the next one. The longing isn't satisfied. They're still hoping. They have to prove themselves still. They have to work for another one to make it work. And they find they're just enslaved to this cycle. With blinders on, the world rushes forward, filling up its disappointment with endless pursuit of more. There's a wonderful, has anybody seen Oliver Twist? The movie? Okay, hold on. Who hasn't seen Oliver Twist? Put your hand up. I just want to see. Okay, do you know the story? So I'll just give you this little, I don't know if we have any pictures of Oliver Twist up there or not. But there's this moment, he's an orphan, and he's in an orphanage, and all of the orphans are, oh, there they are. Okay, perfect. They're in an orphanage, and there's the taskmaster over them. They are getting just the bare minimum. They get a little bowl of gruel every day. And they're sitting around the tables, and there's this moment that they've eaten their meager food. And they've finished that single portion of gruel, and they're drawing lots amongst themselves because no one's happy, and everybody is longing for more, right? They're drawing lots, and Oliver gets the long straw, the short straw. And so he has to go up, and he's afraid of the headmaster. And he walks up with, this headmaster standing there with his big hat, his disapproving gaze, and his beady little eyes, right? And trembling, he brings his bowl up to the headmaster. He says this famous line. He says, please, sir, I want some more. I want some more. He's saying, sir, what you've given me is not enough. And this morning, I feel like Oliver Twist when I think about our desires. Is it takes courage to hold up your bowl to this world, the masters of this world, and say, I want some more. And then to realize that they are not going to give it to you. Anybody know that? You're not going to get it. You're not going to find it in this world. And if you can, I just want you to picture yourself holding up that bowl this morning and saying, I want more. I want more. I want you just to put that in your heart. Do you want more? Do you want more? And that's what John 6 is ultimately about. We're going to read it in just a second. It calls us to be like Oliver Twist and confront the many masters we've been serving about their failure to provide for us. This world is not provided. This world is not enough. We're still longing and we want more. And it's the very heart of this conflict that provokes Jesus' miracle in John 6. And it's there we'll be challenged to see that Jesus' answer to our unmet desires is not found in getting more from this world, but in finding enough. Amen? We will find our answer to our desires is not in getting more from this world, but in finding enough in Him. So let's read John 6 together. We'll read the first 15 verses. Everybody ready? I know that's a long intro, but here we go. After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. And a large crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and he sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then and seeing the large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said this to test him, for he knew himself what he would do. Philip answered him. He said, 200 denarii worth of bread, which is 8 months' wages, would not be enough for each of them to get a little, to have a taste. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told the disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who's come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. All right. Now, it's a beautiful miracle, isn't it? I mean, there's 5,000 plus. I mean, we think maybe as much as 15,000 people probably ate with women and children. It's a beautiful miracle. And hidden inside of it is glory about who Jesus is. And the way we'll work through it is that there's 2 really important misunderstandings that occur within the story. 2 important ones. The first is the disciples misunderstanding the question that Jesus is asking. He says he's testing them, and they didn't pass the, just to not spoil it, but they didn't pass the test, right? And then the second is the second misunderstanding is that the people who received the miracle, they misunderstand its intent. They want him to then become king. And Jesus is trying to tell them something in that moment. And our goal this morning is that by rightly understanding what the question Jesus was asking, rightly understanding what the miracle was meant, we will answer the question of what to do with all of these desires. We're holding up our bowls this morning. We're saying we need something. All right, so let's observe the scene, and we'll do it with 3 ways, noticing 3 things that we can understand Jesus' question, because it's really the hinge point of the whole story. The story tells us first, when Jesus and his disciples leave from where they had been in search of a more remote place, they want to go and rest. They choose this grassy hillside on the far side of the sea to sit down. They're trying to get away from the crowd and relax. But they don't do that for long because, two, despite their efforts for privacy and rest, the crowd follows, having seen the signs that Jesus has performed on the sick. And I want you to note, there are, we think probably 15,000 people that are streaming out of where they were, out of the city, streaming out to this kind of remote place, like a processional, right? With all of their longing, they're moving towards Jesus. And I just want you to see that picture in your mind. It's a whole parade of people leaving a place to chase after the one they long for. And when John tells them, then John tells us some more important information. He says, 3, it's the Passover feast of the Jews was at hand. It's the time of the Passover. Now, remember last week, if you were here, Jesus said, now it was the Sabbath, and we said, bum, 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 right? It's the same thing in this story. When we hear the words that it's the time of the Passover, it's important. It's telling us we should take our cue to understand what these people are sensing and longing for. So, what is the Passover? Do you know? Maybe you don't know what the Passover is. It's an annual Jewish festival of freedom. The Passover is all about freedom. A feast that happened in the spring. We celebrate Easter during Passover now. It's a spring where people would flock to Jerusalem, so they would all gather together and caravan to Jerusalem to celebrate, so the city would be full. And it commemorated the climactic act of salvation by God through Moses when they were spared God's judgment over the firstborn. They were passed over, and they were escaped and delivered into the desert. Anybody seen the movie The Ten Commandments? You know the story. They go out into the desert. They parade out. Almost the exact same picture we just saw. A whole bunch of people leaving to go chase after the promise. And Passover is a time when they declared to everyone who could hear that Israel, the Jews, were nobody's slaves. They said, we escaped slavery. God delivered us. And who we are is not slaves anymore, right? They sang Jonathan Helser's, I'm no longer a slave to fear, right? They were singing that the whole way, and they're shouting and declaring it. They're no longer slaves, which is ironic because they're captive to Rome, right? They have Roman overlords, and there they are declaring it in the midst of it. We're no longer slaves, we're free. It was a celebration that stirred their sense of national identity and pride. You know, like if there were flags to fly, they were flying them. They were remembering the birth of their nation, no longer slaves to Egypt, but beloved children of the one God who created everything, who was over everything, and was the great God of all, who would deliver them. And it was a week, not only for remembering what God had done through the prophet Moses, but a week when they were filled with this anticipation. If you were in Passover at this time, you would have been, your national pride. God was with us. We're God's people, and he's going to deliver us. And we're waiting for a new prophet to come, another Moses to come, who will save us and set us free. And that's a prophecy Moses spoke, actually, Deuteronomy 18. He said, I know I've delivered you. Together with God, you've been delivered, and I led you. But there's someone who's coming, another Moses, a prophet like me, who will come and deliver you. And listen to his words. Now, Israel served the Almighty God, and so the way they thought about their life was any oppression any occupation, anybody that was over them in this world, they were simply temporary. They would outweight them because God was going to be faithful to them. That was their covenant, right? God was going to be faithful to them. The only question then for Israel was, when would God act? When would God move? Who would arise and lead them from within Israel? Who would start this revolutionary moment? And all of that anticipation was what they talked about when they would say Messiah. They were looking for the one who would come and deliver them, a prophet like Moses or Elijah, a prophet, a king, an anointed one to come. So can you feel that this morning? They are longing and they are looking for the one who would lead them. It's hard to downplay how tangible those hopes would have been. In fact, we know that during the Passover, it got so heated in the city. Imagine all of these, for all intents and purposes, slaves. They're celebrating their freedom festival, and Rome is over top of them, and they're pushing up against them, going, we're free, we're not slaves. And the Romans were scared enough about them just kind of boiling over that they would appease them. And you know what they would do? They would say, okay, yeah, you guys are free. We'll release to you a prisoner to declare that you guys are, every year, we'll give you one person just as a celebration to mark the Passover that you guys are really free. Does anybody remember Barabbas? That's what they were doing, Passover. They're saying, just taste the freedom a little bit. Now, the thing we're learning about John's signs is, so there's the scene. It's contentious. They're excited. They're anticipating. They're longing. And in John's signs, we keep seeing something. Each of the miracles represent moments that stirred something in Jesus' own heart and identity. They moved him with compassion. They've pulled something out of him. And whether it's the setting, the timing, or the need that he sees, each one of the 7 moments all seem to trigger some action that arises out of Jesus' own identity as the Son of God or Messiah. So I want you to ask, this may have happened to you before. Who has been moved by compassion of the Holy Spirit? You're listening to someone's story. It doesn't, Christian, not Christian, you're just listening, and there's something that's moved within you. Has anybody experienced that? You maybe, and it probably flows out of your own experience, but if you're a parent and you're listening to someone share about their love for their child, but that child is disconnected from them somehow. Have you heard someone share that? And there's something within you that aches, isn't there? And there's not only that, but there's a longing within you to do something, isn't there? We long to say, I wish I could do something for you. I wish I could give you something of myself to help you. And this is what Jesus is feeling as he watches the crowd that day. Do you remember the first sign, how a wedding stirs Jesus' heart for his own wedding? How when he sees the Father's love for his dying son, our second sign, that he was stirred because of his own, the love of the Father in his heart for everybody who was dying of sin. And how last week, how a paralyzed man waiting for a day when heaven would come pulled something out of him because he said, I'm the one, and it's time. And so he wants to give something to those guys. So here we have a huge group of people who have made a mass exodus out of the wilderness because of their longing for deliverance. It's been compounded because it's Passover, and they're singing the songs of freedom. And there's this anticipation of the arrival of another prophet like Moses. And there's Jesus looking up, knowing that all of these things are about to become true. That he's come to satisfy all of these longings. He looks up and he sees them coming courageously with their bowls in hand, having declared to their earthly masters, like Oliver Twist, that they're hungry, and they've eaten their fill of this earthly bread, and they want more. They want something else. In this moment, they want to be truly free. They're calling out to God, and it moves Jesus' heart. It stirs him to do what he does next. And what does he do next? He asks them a question to test his disciples before he provides a miracle. He says he knows what he's about to do, but he wants to ask his disciples, and he wants to ask us today, if we understand what he was doing. Do you know why he asked the question he asked? Do you feel what he felt as he watched people in need? And we're surrounded by that, aren't we? People in need. We're needy. And the question clarifies what we do when we're in need. So here's the question. And the disciples misunderstand. Jesus asked this question, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He says, where are we to buy bread? Philip answers, he steps forward and he says, I know we don't have enough resources. It would take 8 months to work for every person here to just get a bite. And Andrew follows by saying, not much different. He says, we don't have enough resources. The meager things we have are not enough to share with anybody. What are 5 loaves and some fish amongst so many? And the misunderstanding they make is that Jesus didn't ask them if they had enough food to share or if they had enough money to afford to buy bread. He asked them if they knew where to get bread so that people can eat. Do you see that? What Jesus is asking them and testing them about isn't a question of resource. He's not asking them, do you guys have enough? Do you have enough money? Do you have enough resources to make it work? He's asking them a question about source, not resource. He's asking a question about, do they know the source? You could have $1 billion, and if you don't know where a good bakery is, it's meaningless, right? It all matters where you look. So Jesus is testing them to see if they know and if we know that the important question in our longing is not about the resources that we have, but if we know the source. So do you have longings this morning? And the question isn't, will your needs get met? Or will you find the longings of your heart? But how and where do you go to get them met? This is the question that concerns Jesus. And it's a test that is meant to make them remember Moses. See, here's the question. Here's what's happening. Jesus is reenacting in this moment a whole scene between Moses and the people after they left Egypt. Because they've been delivered, but instead of going in and saying, we trust you, God, you're the one, if we have you, we have everything, right? And this is the conclusion God was trying to lead them to. You have an enemy at your back, well, I'll protect you. You have a river or a sea in front of you, I'll split it, right? You have needs, I'll provide for them. You need water, I'll make it come out of a rock. See, God's trying to tell them, if you have a need, but you have me, you have enough. You have everything. But they don't get that. They look at the land, they see the giants, and they say, we can't obey you. We can't go with you. And so they wander for 40 years. And ultimately, they get a second chance. And this is what happened. This is what God says in Deuteronomy 8, verse 2. Listen, and the whole chapter is incredible. But listen to this. Moses tells them, you shall remember the whole way that the Lord God has led you for these 40 years in the wilderness. So he led them in the desert. Why? In circles for 40 years. Why? Because he wanted to humble them. He wanted, and listen to this language, he wanted to test them to see if they knew what was in their heart. Whether you would keep the commandments or not. And he humbled you, and he let you hunger, and he fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, all so that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Do you see that? And there's Jesus. He sees the crowd coming, and he says, these are like the people of Israel. Well, they are. And they're longing for the promised land. They're longing for the freedom of God. And I want to know the same question that Moses asked. And I'm going to test them with the same test, which is, do they know the source? Do you know the source? Do you know that you could have even all of the bread that you want, but that man doesn't live by just bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God? The right answer to Jesus' where question is the same as the one for Moses. The bread you've seen supplied right in front of you is proof that heaven is the only true source for life. I'm going to make bread out of nothing. In fact, I'm going to make... What do you need this morning? This is Israel in the desert. Just think about what you want this morning. What is it that you desire? God said to Israel, oh, you're hungry? I can make it rain bread. It's incredible. Watch this. I'm going to make it rain bread from heaven. Do you see what the point of it is? I'm going to make it rain, whatever you want. But the point isn't that you get what you want. It's that you realize that there's someone in heaven who controls all of it. and he wants to give it to us. And it's telling us, and this is the same thing with all of the signs, is it's not just bread in your hand. It's that you seek the one who gave the bread, and you know that he's with you today for your desires. You're holding up your bowl. He's saying, if you come to me, you come to the right place. He says, seek the bread of heaven. And the rest of John 6 is full of this. You should read it. It's incredible. But Jesus, he says, he's asking us, do you know what the bread of heaven is? And he answers and he says, I am the bread of heaven. I'm the bread of life. I'm the source for your physical and your every spiritual need that you have. And so all of a sudden, we're here today going, okay, well, we need to eat that bread. Does anybody want that bread? The bread that never runs out? And not just the bread, but who wants the giver of the bread? Himself, right? And then Jesus says, okay, you want to eat the bread? Well, here's something you need to know. You have to, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no life in me, right? This morning, unless you eat Jesus' flesh and drink his blood, you have no part in him. Now, everybody's going, well, he didn't really mean, what did he mean, right? What does it mean? And that's what happens. Everybody hears it in those days, and they're listening, and they're going, I'm not a cannibal, and I'm not going to drink blood, and I'm not going to eat flesh. And Jesus is saying, understand something. And I want to explain what he meant, because I think it's often misunderstood. So here's a story to tell you something of what he meant. Does anybody remember King David? And in the time of King David, they were fighting against a people called the Philistines. And he mentions, as in their fight, it's the end of a long day, and he turns to his commanders and his mighty men, and he's just longing. And he says, I want to have a drink. I want to have a drink of water. And so someone comes up with a cup. I'm just making this part up, but they come up with a cup of water. And he says, no, I don't want just any cup of water. I want a cup of water from the well in Bethlehem. Right? And he said, I want to drink from that well. I'm longing for something that I can't get my hands on. It's this homesick feeling. It's like, like someone says, well, here's a chocolate chip cookie. And you say, I'm not longing for a chocolate chip cookie. I'm longing for the ones that my mom made, right? It's just, there's something about them, the care. And he's longing for this well, this water from the well in Bethlehem. It's more than water that he's longing for. And the problem, though, was that anybody would have gone and get it for him, except there's an army in the way. There's the Philistines. You can't get through there. And so upon hearing David's longing, his three fiercest warriors, it's a great story, they go behind enemy lines, they break through, and they fight just to get their king a cup of water from the well of Bethlehem. And they bring it back, right? Imagine, you just don't want to spill the water, You get all the way there, and they bring back what's more than a cup of water. And you can imagine them coming back so triumphant, having risked everything and presenting the cup to David, right? On their knee. Our king, our great king, here's your cup. And David realizes what they've done for him, what they've risked. And he says something incredible. He says, God forbid that I should drink the blood of these men who went at the risk of their lives. He's saying, this cup that you have secured for me, I will not profit from your sacrifice. He's saying, I won't drink the cup. It's water, but it's not water. It's their blood. It's more than I need. This cup I'm unworthy of this cup that you've brought me. And so what does he do? He doesn't drink it. He pours it out on the ground. I mean, it's one of those crazy stories where you realize there's more happening, there's more going on. And I want you to understand, here is Jesus, having perceived all of our unmet longings. He's watched us. There we are. We've marched up and we've got our bowl. And we've said to the world, I want more. And then he says, come to me. And he's given us the bread, and we come to him with these unmet longings. We say, you're the one. You're the one. He knows that the thirst that we're dealing with in our lives, the longings that we have, the hungers that we have, aren't just kind of day-to-day things. They're actually going to lead to our death. will die unfulfilled. And so just like David's mighty men, Jesus, having perceived the longing of the world, the need of the world for something that lasts forever, he breaks through enemy lines at the cross and goes through sin and death at the expense of his own life. Also, he can come and march into our camp and kneel down before us and say, here's the food and the drink that you're longing for. This is what he does. He says, I've poured it all out for you. And here's this cup. And he's telling us, don't refuse what lasts forever. Don't refuse it. If you want to abide, if you want eternal life, if you want to make this the source of your life, he says, I died precisely that you might profit from my sacrifice. And yes, just like David, you are unworthy. Just like David, you're unworthy to drink the cup, and yet I give it to you freely. I've laid down my life for you. We look at what he's done, and like David, we can see in the cup and in the bread, we're drinking is not just the cup of his blood, or it's a cup of water, it's a cup of blood that seals his covenant. It's not just bread, it's the bread of his body that was broken so that we might be healed. And having tasted it, what we find is it's enough. It satisfies all of our longings, all of our endless worrying about how much it costs, if we're going to be enough, if we have enough, if we are enough. It goes silent when we receive the gift of his life. It's sufficient. The disciples, they noticed this. At the end of chapter 6, Jesus turns to them and he asks them the same question. He says, do you guys want to leave too? Everybody else is leaving, but I've gone to secure the cup of my blood for your longings and your life. He says, do you want? And they answer rightly, finally, at the end. They say, where could we go? You alone have the words of life, and we have believed and come to know that you are the Holy One of God. He's saying, we've come to believe you're the source. You're Moses, the new one. You're the deliverer. You're the Messiah. Now, for the sake of time this morning, I won't dig into how the crowd responds, except to note just a few things. Verse 14 and 15 tells us, having seen what Jesus has done with the bread, they rightly name who he is. They say, remember at verse 14? We can read it. It says, when they saw what the sign that he had done, they said, this is indeed the prophet who has come into the world. But what they don't understand is they don't discern how God intended to become the king, how Jesus intended to become the king. They got it right. He's the prophet that Moses promised, the king they've been waiting for, but he wasn't. Jesus is telling them, I am not coming to be your military or political savior. I'm not arguing in the political arenas. I'm not fighting a human fight. See, Jesus is perceiving they want to come and take him by force and make him king, and so he hides because he says, I'm not a human king. And I want us to understand, there would come a day in the garden, do you remember, where he is taken by force and he's planted on a cross. And do you remember what it says above his head? He's King of the Jews. See, Jesus knows there's going to come a day when people will take him by force. And he says, but that, and actually it happens on the Passover. It happens on the Passover. And Jesus is saying, yeah, there's a Passover where I'm going to be made king, but this isn't it. On this one, he says he knew when the King of heaven would be crowned, it would be on Passover, but he would not be crowned as one feasting with his friends at a table, but as the Lamb of God that was slain. Right? This is Jesus, the Lamb of God. He knows that the King of heaven would be crowned while he was taken by force, but it would not be to lead the army of Israel, but to die alone on a cross. How does Jesus become king? He gives up his life. By death, he conquers. By his sacrifice, he provides. And that's why I want us this morning to take communion together, because I want us to look at what he's done. I want us to look up at him. And we started this morning like orphans with our bowl in hand, telling this broken world that its food is not enough and that we're not satisfied. And yet, look at what Jesus teaches us to do with our longings. Your longings this morning. He says, look to the source. Don't look at what you have. Don't wonder if you're enough. Look to the one who has more than enough. Like a child, and this is the beautiful thing in the story. Yeah, the worship team, why don't you guys come on up, sure. Like a child, there's this little boy in the story, right? And what does he bring him? He brings him all that he has. He brings him his loaf and his fishes. And this morning, that's really what this represents. It's what we have in our hand. It's the natural need that we have to eat and to taste. And we want to bring this, and we want to say, and this is the question, this is what's so loaded about communion, is when we raise the cup, what we're declaring is this is enough for me. Imagine all of your longings, this is enough. Do you believe that this morning? This is enough. This is the bread of heaven. And this is what the boy realized when he put it in the hands of Jesus. When it was blessed and it was broken, it was multiplied for every single need that he had. God longs to multiply his life in our life. All of his needs, all of our needs and desires and hopes and dreams.